I
I
don't.
know a lot of people. I just don't.
Hi, I have a lot of germs, so I'll just say hi. Yes. I've been sneezing into my hands, so I don't know if you can update me. Thank you. Oh, hello. Such a great pleasure to see you. Yes. Yeah. Such a great pleasure to see you. Yeah, we're doing our whole log lots workshop this year on climate change in fall and animal rights in the spring. So it's our environmental group. Yeah, so it's exciting. Yeah, I put up in English, but it was long. Thank you. Very good to see you. I'm not ill. I just have I just don't want to transmit. You know, colds are contagious for a week after they're gone, and so I don't like to get other people at home. Actually, this is my usual day off. My one day off. So I did a lot of work in the morning, and I'm not going to run outside because it's very windy. I'm having very small changes, so I didn't have winter. But I do 4 days a week running, 2 days a week walking. So tomorrow I'll go. Yeah. But last week I was relaxed with the really hot wood outside because it was just hot wood. But I did skis. My son did skis on the roof. Hasn't been bothering you much. To me, anything below 30 actually. Well, I'm in my 60s, so I hear say something so it's really
Well, do you mind sitting on the floor over there?
no, I don't mind. Well, but one minute. And so I have an epping cold and it will be contagious. Colds are contagious for a week after you use them. So. Great. No, it's not. I mean, it's contagious only that I cough
Good afternoon. My name is Alan Rudolph, and I'm the Vice President of Research here at CSU, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to this afternoon's Colloquium on Ethics. This is a program the Provost started with broad participation across campus to really examine key issues in ethics that challenge our society today, and we've got a great speaker, Dr. Martha Nussbaum, here who'll be introduced in a moment. The topic of the day is also one that compels us as a society, compels us as a campus. Many of us have aging generations that we're still caring for. We have very close touch to the issue. On campus as well, we've taken the opportunity to focus on this topic in many ways. We're in the process of establishing a Center for Healthy Aging, and we've been involved with recruiting a director. So it's a really great time on campus to have the presentations this afternoon, and we'll have another one here later this afternoon by our speaker. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's colloquium. It's a real opportunity for some dialogue. You can see microphones around, and we are videotaping, so the audience should know that we will be recording and streaming this, so you want to be careful with what you say, perhaps. But anyway, we encourage real constructive dialogue and hope you find this stimulating. And so with no further ado, I'm going to introduce the new Dean of the Colorado School of Public Health, Dr. Jonathan Samet, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and to have the privilege of introducing Professor Nussbaum. This is my first visit to CSU as the School of Public Health Dean, and I know I have many more to come. I'm going to make short what could be a very long introduction. Professor Nussbaum is the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics, appointed to the Law School and Philosophy Department at the University of Chicago. Among her many awards, two recent are of note: the 2017 Jefferson Lecturer in Humanities and a 2016 Kyoto Prize Laureate in Arts and Philosophy, along with honorary degrees from 56 colleges and universities from throughout the world. She received her undergraduate training at NYU and master's and PhDs at Harvard. She has written prolifically and widely. I had done a time series analysis, and I thought she published a book every other year, but 2016, 17, and 18 will all see books. I would comment that, not knowing her work well, I turned to her new book, the topic of which we'll hear about today, Aging Thoughtfully. The themes resonated, particularly since we are both above the mandatory retirement age in Finland, which I learned about. The chapter on retirement policy gave me good reason for just taking a new leadership job when I should perhaps be retired, at least in Finland. The book was distinguished by the clarity of thought and the friendliness of its prose. She is a philosopher who communicates to everyone. So, Professor Nussbaum, we look forward to your talk, Aging, Stigma, and Disgust. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And although I can't see anyone's face, you're in total darkness, thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to your questions. I should say that the new book is actually a co-authored book, co-authored with my legal economist colleague, Saul Levmore, and so that is a feature of it, that it's a fun dialogue, and you'll hear about that in a minute. So, aging people have suffered from social discrimination and stigma ever since there were enough of us alive to be noticed as a group. Stigma and prejudice are, in fact, the focus of the first surviving philosophical work on aging in the Western philosophical tradition, and I think still the best. Cicero's De Senectute on Old Age, written in 45 BCE, when Cicero was 62. Because the literary structure of the work is part of its attack on stigma, I'm going to pause to describe it. Cicero, both statesman and philosopher, composed the work during the chaotic events of the Roman civil wars, as he attempted to defend the dying Roman Republic, an effort for which he was assassinated a year later. He dedicates the work to his best friend, Titus Pomponius Atticus, noting that its purpose is to divert both men from the anxiety of the political struggle. And how will he divert them? By writing a philosophical dialogue on old age, the De Senectute. Cicero frames aging, then, not as a hideous horror story, but as a lighter topic than the all-too-present theme of the impending loss of political liberty. As he immediately observes, he and Atticus, who was then 65, are not really old yet. That's quite interesting, I think, in ancient Rome. But they're on their way, so they better look ahead and scout the territory. The lead character in the dialogue he writes, who is a historical figure named Cato, is 83 at the time of the dialogue's dramatic date, 150 BC, and he's depicted accurately as playing an active role in politics, writing several books, learning new languages, and enjoying friendships, both with people of his own age and with many people who are younger. Unlike the Western philosophical tradition's other most well-known work on aging, the relentlessly depressing La Vieillesse by Simone de Beauvoir, published in 1970, a work stuffed full of every social stereotype known to the 20th century, and in which these stereotypes parade as necessary universal truths, the De Senectute exhibits a refreshing determination to confront stereotype and stigma. First of all, two young men in their 20s, the other characters in the dialogue, are depicted as enjoying Cato's company. They've sought him out because, as they note, they would quite like to get to be that old, and in case they do, they would like to know more about what that time of life is like. They feel that Cato is doing very well, so they want to know why, given the negative reputation attached to that time of life. In response, Cato gracefully, cogently rebuts 4 charges commonly made, he says, against his time of life: that aging people are inactive and unproductive, that they have no physical strength, that they no longer enjoy bodily pleasures, and that the nearness of death makes them prone to debilitating anxiety. Particularly striking is his use it or lose it philosophy. By continued disciplined activity, both mental and physical, one remains strong and active. As Cicero uses Cato to rebut those common charges, he's clearly having some fun himself, for he portrays Cato as mentally and physically impressive, but also as having at least 1 or 2 mildly annoying traits that are associated with old age. Cato talks too much, listens too little, he's fond of long digressions about his own past, and he focuses too much on his own pet hobbies without considering the interests of the audience. In this case, Cato, who is the real-life author of a very boring work about farming called the De Agricultura, bores the 2 young men and the reader by long digressions about mulching and plowing, and there's an especially hilarious passage about the miraculous properties of manure. Well, some Romans did find these topics interesting, but we know that Cicero didn't, so the portrait is playful. On the whole, then, old age isn't perfect, but it acquits itself pretty well, rebutting stigma. I'll return to Cicero's arguments frequently in what follows, but for now, I repeat, smart people knew already in 45 BC that aging was the subject of denigrating and inaccurate stereotypes, and that these stereotypes cause real harm to aging people, marginalizing them and diminishing their lives. And they knew already that one way philosophy can contribute to human development is to question those stereotypes with good arguments, and let's hope also with a sense of humor. So in this talk, I'm going to follow Cicero's lead, though by a different route, examining the particular stigma attached to the aging body, its origins, its relationship to and difference from other types of stigma, and its powerful effects. Cato has good arguments, but his case for aging lacks an underlying psychology of prejudice, which I'll attempt to supply. And finally, I'll propose some directions for public policy. Now, I've long argued as a philosophical legal theorist for a theory of stigma and group discrimination that makes the emotion of disgust central. I developed this account in a book called Hiding from Humanity, using results in cognitive psychology to show how disgust operates in a wide range of types of discrimination, including anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, and homophobia. I then made the normative argument that disgust is never a sufficient condition to make an act illegal when it causes no harm to non-consenting parties. Then, in 2010, in a book on sexual orientation and constitutional law, I developed the theory further and connected it empirically to recent discrimination against gays and lesbians. And right now, I'm part of a large comparative project with our center in New Delhi, which is going to result in a book that will come out next year from OUP Delhi called The Empire of Disgust, Discrimination and Policy in the US and India. So it's an ongoing project. But here then, I'm going to begin by summarizing my theory before looking more closely at the special stigma attached to aging bodies. So what is disgust, and why is its social role troubling? The emotion has recently been the subject of some important research by a US team of experimental psychologists led by Paul Rosen. All human beings appear to share an acute discomfort when confronted by our own bodily fluids, excretions, and smells, and also by the decay of the corpse. So I use the term primary disgust for a shrinking from contamination by such objects and by other objects that closely resemble them in smell or feel, such as insects and animals that are slimy, smelly, and so on. Primary disgust, though not present at birth, is culturally universal and is probably grounded in inherited tendencies. Although this aversive reaction may in some cases protect people from real danger, and probably that was its evolutionary origin, Rosen shows that its cognitive content is actually quite different from that of fear. It's about contamination or contact rather than danger. It's a reaction to the animality and decay of the human body, and it's both under-inclusive and over-inclusive for real danger. That is to say, many dangerous things are not disgusting. Think of poisonous mushrooms, for example. And people feel disgust even when they're rationally convinced that all danger is absent, as with many experiments Rosen did with sterilized cockroaches and other non-dangerous but disgusting creatures. Rosen concluded that in disgust, we're rejecting something about our own animality. Although I think he's not specific enough at this point, I have to do more work at that point in my book, it's evident from his research that we don't reject all signs of our kinship with the other animals, not traits such as strength, speed, and beauty. What we reject is what's associated with decay and mortality. We're rejecting our own animal weakness and vulnerability. Now, all that might be harmless enough, although I would argue it's always problematic to encourage that type of self-loathing. In all known societies, however, people actually don't stop there, and now we arrive at what I call projective disgust. People seek to create a sort of buffer zone between themselves and their own animality by identifying a group of humans, often, and I think pretty much always, a powerless minority, who can be targeted as the quasi-animals, and by projecting onto that group various animal characteristics, which they have to no greater degree than the ones doing the projecting: bad smell, animal sexuality, and so on. The so-called thinking seems to be, if those quasi-animal humans stand between us and our own animal stench and decay, we're that much further from being merely animal and mortal ourselves. And there's no known society in which we don't find subgroups to whom irrationally properties of smelliness, sliminess, hypersexuality, and in general, hyperanimality are imputed. Now, there are many varieties of disgust stigma. In European anti-Semitism, Jews were depicted as hyperbodily, smelly, hypersexual, but also as crafty and intelligent. They were regarded then with fear and envy as well as disgust. African Americans in the US, by contrast, were, and unfortunately at times still are, imagined as hypersexual and also as smelly, bestial, and stupid. They were regarded with both disgust and bodily fear, but not with envy. Another contrast involves strength. African Americans have been imagined as physically powerful and aggressive to upper Hindu castes who observed, and in some cases still do observe, untouchability. Untouchables were foul, weak, but not particularly aggressive. In misogyny, women in so many cultures have been imagined as disgusting, and yet that disgust is frequently combined with sexual desire and arousal in such a way that no less an authority on sex than Sigmund Freud argued that bodily disgust is an inevitable part of sexual arousal. Feminists are surely right to see in this disgust, so oddly linked with attraction, a linchpin of gender-based denials of moral and intellectual equality. And yet, the disgust reaction does not lead to avoidance of intimacy, but rather to an intimacy and domesticity characterized by anxious attempts to police the female body. It's not that women are never avoided as contaminating. Taboos surrounding menstruation in many cultures testify to the power of misogynistic stigma, and that polite and sophisticated observer of morals, the 18th century philosopher Adam Smith, observed that males like to avoid females after their sexual desire is gratified. Quote, "When we have dined, we order the covers to be removed." Contemporary US legal scholar William Ian Miller concurs, arguing that such male reactions are tenacious and will always impede gender equality. And of course, this disgust is fully compatible with sharing a dwelling, food, and a bed. I won't talk now here because of time about sexual orientation disgust, but I have written a lot about the special features of that. But now we begin to arrive at the heart of the matter for our current purposes. Two instances of disgust stigma are different from all the others and interestingly similar to one another. Disgust for people with physical and mental disabilities is directed at weakness and inability, seen very likely as a lot potentially open to all human beings. It's not linked to any type of envy and not to any type of fear, except the fear of becoming like that. Disgust for the bodies of aging people, who are, of course, often also members of the category of the disabled, has a similar flavor. There's no envy, no fear of superior power or intelligence, not even fear of an ungovernable sexuality or a propensity to rape others, just a kind of horror at the prospect of being broken down and allegedly decaying close to death in that way. For so-called able-bodied people, there's an uneasy comfort in looking at the bodies of people with disabilities. They're different, and I'm not like that. With aging bodies, no such comfort is available. However much a younger person tries to other the aging, at some level she knows that this is her in the future unless she meets the yet worse fate of premature death. Projective disgust always leads to some type of avoidance of bodily contact. Again, though, the type and extent vary. African Americans were forbidden to use white people's drinking fountains, swimming pools, lunch counters, hotel beds, and of course sexual contact was strictly forbidden and was held to be a felony in many states. Widely, though, white men had sex with and sexually abused black women. Yet, an African American might prepare and serve food for a white family. An Indian untouchable, by contrast, could never serve food in an upper caste family, and as I've noted, Dalits also couldn't share lodging or drinking taps. So there's similarities and differences. So the manifest irrationalities of these differences are just morbidly fascinating. As for people with mental and physical disabilities, they've often been denied access to mainstream space, both public and private. Sometimes these denials are covered by the claim of expense, how costly it would be to make our buildings fully accessible to people using wheelchairs. Well, of course, no more expensive than to make them inaccessible if we're starting de novo, but dominant groups tend to forget how they've formed the world, excluding others. How costly it would be to keep our sidewalks safe for people who are blind so that those people could use them in safety. As the blind law professor Jacobus ten Broek observed in a famous article called The Right to Be in the World, the Disabled in the Law of Torts, the very standard of due care in tort law denies people like him the right to be in the world. Meanwhile, children with disabilities were typically excluded almost from birth. Many have been relegated to institutions. Most, until very recently, have been denied access to integrated education. Most, until recently, have lacked meaningful access to public spaces, whether recreational or utilitarian. The testimony that led to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act showed that a common so-called justification for such exclusions was that so-called normal people find it very upsetting to look at people with disabilities. I should say my own city actually had laws called ugly laws, which made it illegal for a person with a manifest disability to appear in public space. My former colleague, who's now in New York, but it's the same story, has a neurological disorder. He could not have appeared in any public space in Chicago until rather recently. Well, now let's zero in on age. Projective disgust always targets imputed and often fantasized characteristics that are thought to be somehow contaminating to the disgusted person, reminders of an animal nature that has not been embraced. So what's special about the prejudice against aging bodies? First, the shrinking from contact seems to be at least a little less mediated by culture than in most of our other cases. The stigma attached to wrinkles, drooping skin, and other signs of aging seems to be culturally universal in some form. Pre-verbal children already show avoidance behavior when given a choice between an aging and a non-aging person. It's at least plausible that an aversion to aging bodies is based on an evolutionary tendency that's connected to reproductive fitness. Even if children's disgust is far from totally innate, getting many cues from the surrounding culture, at least a part of it may be based on innate tendencies. Second, the stigma has at least some truth and is not a total fantasy. Aging people are indeed, in a sense, closer to death on average than younger people, although one should note that the peak age for homicide death in the United States is 21 to 24, and at least some of the stigmatized characteristics are really functions of old age, drooping skin, age spots, and so on, although, of course, they're exacerbated by environmental factors. Racial stigma and caste stigma rest entirely upon fantasy. The bodies of these subgroups smell no different from bodies in the dominant group, nor is the sexuality of the stigmatized group any more animal than any other instance of human sexuality. Gender, I think, may be somewhere in the middle, some rather complicated and not binary underlying biological realities, and over the top, a set of binary social stereotypes that are basically fictive. Disability, a category that, of course, overlaps considerably with aging, is more like aging, a good deal of biology, but also a good deal of fantasy and stereotype. Now, as Cato says, however, most of the stereotype of aging people is not based on truth. The aging are widely believed to be less competent across all parameters. For example, to be incapable of understanding normal speech, explaining why medical personnel typically use a high-pitched, hyper-articulate baby speech that's called elder speak to address them. Like people who use wheelchairs, who are often addressed also in baby talk, even though no mental impairment is present, aging people are assumed to be less competent as a class and across all life functions without first assessing the abilities of the individual. And this is surely wrong. The slight admixture of truth feeds the fantasy. Cicero's Cato is well aware of this area of stigma, and he rebuts it eloquently by pointing to the many instances of high achievement in aging people. Particularly lovely is the story of how the heirs of the great poet Sophocles were trying to get him declared incompetent so they could get a hold of his property. So they hauled him into court, where he read to the jury some speeches from the in-progress manuscript of his new play, The Oedipus at Colonus, which he was just then composing at the age of around 90. It's one of the most famous Greek tragedies that exists, right? He then asks the jury, well, do you really think that this is the work of a mentally incompetent person? Well, he won the case. Cato's argument does not, of course, give us statistics. It just points to a group of cases. But the point is that the very existence of such cases means that we need to examine the individual. And he addresses the distributional point by observing that the Roman Senate is actually named after old men. Senes is the word for old men, because it's full of them and because Romans are acknowledging that deliberation and wisdom are virtues of aging men. More generally, says Cato, the difference between competence and incompetence, whether mental or physical, is largely made as one ages by daily habit and practice. Some activities that require a lot of physical strength are, on average, much harder for people as they age. But even here, habit makes a huge difference. He regularly does farming and rides horseback. And I should note that Cicero, at the age of almost 60, stormed a mountain fortress on horseback, so he's talking about himself as well. And intellectual and deliberative pursuits do not diminish at all if people exercise their mental faculties by reading and learning new things. He concludes, my young friends, we should resist old age. We should compensate for its defects by watchful care. We should fight against it as we would fight against a disease. We should adopt a regimen of health. We should do regular, moderate exercise, and we should eat and drink just enough to replenish our strength and not so much as to crush it. Nor indeed should we give attention only to the body. Much greater care should be given to the intellect and the mental faculties, for they too, like lamps, grow dim with time unless we keep them supplied with oil. And then he goes on to talk about learning new languages, which of course has come back into people's awareness as one very important thing for aging people to do. I note that it's very striking that Cato apparently has never heard of Alzheimer's disease. In this otherwise highly realistic work, he would have had to discuss it if it had been a well-known social reality. I think that recent research linking Alzheimer's to air pollution is actually very much a likely explanation for why the Roman world seems unaware of this stuff, this problem. But anyway, that would take me too far from my argument. The third distinctive fact about age prejudice is indicated in the very structure of Cicero's dialogue, which depicts the younger men as seeking out Cato in order to inquire into their own future. Namely, the stigma is associated early on with the felt inevitability that one will enter the stigmatized group if one lives long enough. It's the only out-group into which each and every member of the in-group will inevitably move if he or she lives long enough. The future, however distant, infects the shrinking from the start. As time advances, it becomes not just a projection, but a partial or total self-ascription, and the self-ascription is characteristically mingled with uncertainty and vague dread. Unlike the progress of childhood, which, while hardly uniform in all, is uniform enough for age-related generalizations and bright-line rules to make at least some sense, the progress of aging is both hugely variable among individuals and different across the different aspects of human life. One may be mentally acute with one or more serious physical disabilities. One may be impossible at sprinting while having an undiminished ability to play the piano, or, as Cato notes, to give public orations. Even the mind is plural. One may have problems remembering names without any difficulty talking about politics or culture. So the anxiety about whether the stigma applies to oneself ramifies to embrace the rich plurality of zones of life. As many activities as life contains, so many sources of anxiety about metaphorical or literal wrinkles and sag. In short, disgust is always at some level self-disgust, as one perceives animality in others and shuns it in oneself. But with aging, the truth is front and center. It really is for oneself that one fears. Stigma, learned early and toward others, gradually becomes self-stigma, and self-exclusion, as one's own aging body is seen as a site of decay and future death, by oneself as well as by others. Now, what has more recent research shown us? I'm afraid we have not yet progressed very far beyond Cicero. One thing that's constantly said in all serious research on this topic is that much more research is needed, so all the things I'm about to say should be regarded as highly provisional. Still, several seem relatively solid. First, stereotypes about aging people are in part explicit and in part implicit. As in other areas of bias research, it's now clear that the bias against aging people operates powerfully at a non-conscious level, as prompts associated with aging, words like old and aged, elicit negative reactions even when the subject is not aware of having any such bias. Implicit bias toward the aging is likely to be based on childhood learning, deeply internalized. It will therefore be very difficult to eradicate. The stereotype involves aversive reactions to aging bodies as such, but it also contains more specific beliefs. One, as in Cicero, is that all aging people have declining cognitive capacity and memory. Thus, the very same mistakes and instances of forgetfulness that are ascribed to normal human frailty when a younger person makes them are ascribed to age when an aging person makes them. Similarly, the same physical problems that are ascribed to treatable disease in younger people are ascribed to the inevitable effects of aging when the patient is older. It's particularly true with hearing difficulties because, of course, younger people immediately get their hearing tested, but aging people, they're just like, oh, they're very slow, and that's part of aging, and so on. Since such stereotypes of inevitability have reigned for so long, we actually don't know very much about what the baseline of health is for people at various ages, or even the baseline of adequate nutrition. Ignorance then supports further stereotyping, both about others and also often about oneself. Cato is aware of this problem too, and remarks that if one thinks decline inevitable, one just won't work very hard, and then one really will decline. Even when the stereotype contains a positive element, the positive often contains hidden condescension or negativity. Thus, the positive stereotype of an aging man usually emphasizes what's called wisdom, not analytical ability, or skepticism, subversive challenges to existing norms, and so on. And women are usually denied even wisdom. The positive female stereotype is that of the perfect grandmother, which probably connotes nice, subservient, caring behavior and not anything associated with professional excellence or challenging ideas. We should pause here to observe that these stereotypes involve what, in an important recent book, philosopher Miranda Fricker has called epistemic injustice. That is, aging people are systematically downgraded and disparaged as knowers. Their testimony, their insights, their interventions and discussion, and even, as I've noted, their reports of their own health conditions are all taken to be weak, like the contributions of children. Aging people share epistemic disadvantage with many other marginalized groups. Women, in particular, have long and ubiquitously been at an epistemic disadvantage in law and more generally in society, and this sort of testimonial disadvantage applies to some other marginalized groups as well. But the epistemic disqualification of the aging is unusually acute, since women and African Americans are rarely addressed in baby talk, as is so common for the aging, and it's more acute in today's United States than in at least some times and places, as Cato's observations about the Roman Senate make clear. Senators were taken to be good at arguing, not just sources of grandfatherly wisdom, and Cato seems to have been right about this social norm. At least aging men, then, were treated with some epistemic deference, though not always, as Cato's analysis shows. In today's United States, this deference rarely exists. One has to have significant signs of external authority, such as fame and reputation or high office, for one's epistemic contributions to gain the respect they merit. Thus, aging philosophers such as my collaborator Amartya Sen, who just had his 84th birthday, Jürgen Habermas, 88, and Noam Chomsky, 88, are taken very seriously. But less famous people of a similar age are not. Moreover, if even a famous aging intellectual or judge or politician has a bad day or writes a bad article, immediately it's, oh, there he's or she is losing it. Now, in fact, people do write some bad articles, and probably the people who make such criticisms have themselves done so. But when the writer is aging, the bad article is almost invariably imputed to aging. In the case of my dear friend, the late Hilary Putnam, one of the great philosophers of the last century, who died, partly this century too, who died in 2016 at the age of 89, nobody could say with a straight face that any book he wrote was bad, so they found another way to disparage him epistemically, in an ageistic way, to coin a term. Namely, Putnam wrote a great deal about the philosophy of religion in his later years, so those who wanted to disparage his age did so by disparaging his choice of topic, as if that were easy or soft or even empty, never mind the fact that he was simultaneously coming up with new insights about Carnap. As one might predict, both explicit and implicit bias have real effects on the behavior of aging people themselves. Where health is concerned, stereotypes prevent aging people from seeking treatment for treatable weaknesses and diseases. Should they seek treatment, they may not get what they need. If medical personnel believe this condition, whatever it is just normal aging. Mental performance has been experimentally shown to be directly affected by stereotypes. People do worse on tests of memory and other cognitive abilities when they're primed by reference to stereotypes of aging. And as Cato has noted, we will just stop working on ourselves if we think decline is inevitable. Sometimes aging people cordon themselves off from the ill effects of stereotyping by refusing to identify themselves with the denigrated group. Retaining an idea of oneself as youthful and able has many good effects. On the other hand, this strategy forfeits the usual good effects of in-group solidarity. In other cases of deprived groups suffering from stereotyping, racial, gender, sexual orientation groups, and also disability groups, group solidarity has been very important for revolutionary movements seeking better treatment. But the age stereotype has such a grip on people's self-perception that many people refuse to acknowledge group membership despite its evident benefits. This is changing. The AARP, or ARP, American Association for Retired Persons, has promoted a very useful type of group solidarity and self-respect by making definite progress on many issues. Other nations have lagged behind the U.S. in fighting age discrimination, largely because of the political work of this lobby group. But what about group segregation for a variety of different activities? It seems that many seniors enjoy senior fitness classes, and in many sports, a type of voluntary group segregation seems to improve enjoyment. In the athletic case, I think the group segregation is all right to the extent that it is, insofar as it helps aging people avoid shame and stigma, if they choose that mode of participation. And it's also helpful in the way that ARP is helpful, because the aging body, to be productive, needs specialized attention. One of the nicest parts of the incipient pro-senior revolution is that physical trainers do not now tell aging people to do less. They typically tell them they need to do more. Thus, when I have some typical runner's injury, whether a hamstring strain or Achilles tendonitis, I'm given specific therapy for that problem. But I'm also told firmly that I ought to be doing more core exercises and more exercises for foot tendons, which don't need so much specific attention earlier. So that's a way in which group segregation can promote achievement and useful activity. But there are also many cases in which the segregation itself embodies a pernicious stereotype and seems likely to produce both lowered self-esteem and diminished performance. What would we think of a work-in-progress workshop for older law professors? Opera and symphony performances for older audiences. Well, all too many of those end up that way anyway, for lack of outreach to younger audiences, but that's a different issue. Voting by age group, with different age groups having different political representation, segregation of politicians or voters by age, well, all of those things would be, I think, not just grotesque, but by this point in our history, deeply unpopular. One part of life that can be especially damaged by stigmatizing segregation is friendship. Families have the advantage that they do promote continued contact between the generations, but that kind of contact is not always benign. It can reinforce the stereotype of the non-threatening grandmother, the wise patriarch, rather than promoting attention to the capacities and the preferred activities of the individual. Aging people whose only context for cross-generational friendship is family are vulnerable to a narrowing of their perceived social role. Workplace friendships, I think, are more promising. Another reason to oppose compulsory retirement, which I'll get to in a minute, is that it deprives active aging people of continued friendship with people of many different ages, shunting them off onto the stigmatized track of the retired or the emeritus or emerita. Choosing friends in a variety of different age groups works against complacency, keeps one open to challenges of many types, and prevents stigmatizing segregation and self-segregation. Well, what conclusions might one start to draw for policy? The first one, I think, is that aging people badly need a political movement, indeed a national and international human rights movement akin to the disability rights movement that has made such legal progress. Such a movement sort of exists in the US, where ARP is one of the most powerful lobby groups ever, but in other modern democracies, although lobbying based on class, race, sex, caste, even disability is totally acceptable, there's not yet a strong political movement composed of and working on behalf of people who are aging. I think part of the reason for this is that people in Europe, at least, have a strong social safety net, and so, to a degree, they're less vulnerable as they age than their US counterparts. But another issue is that strong labor movements want a low retirement age and don't bother to distinguish between permission to retire and requirement to retire. But surely part of the issue is shame and the internalization of damaging stereotypes. The feeling that discrimination against older workers is just natural and is not discrimination at all is extremely widespread among both older and younger. A comprehensive study of discrimination against workers over the age of 55 in the US shows that it's very widespread, as has been experimentally confirmed by tests in which fake resumes are submitted, some having an age and some not having an age. The study concludes that people simply do not see this type of discrimination as unjust. It's just natural. The great John Stuart Mill, in his work The Subjection of Women in 1872, said of gender discrimination, "Is there any form of domination that does not seem natural to those who exercise it?" Well, we should now pause to ponder this obvious fact. Feudalism made elites think that serfs were a different type, almost a different species of human being. It took revolution to change consciousness. Racial discrimination, discrimination against women, as Mill notes, have been similarly rationalized by a belief, no doubt sincere, that the discrimination was based upon nature. Discrimination against people with disabilities was not recognized as the social evil it is because for such a long time, people who claimed for themselves the label normal thought that it was just natural, that society catered to their needs and weaknesses, you know, the way steps are built and the way the frequencies that are used in normal music and so on, and they kept the so-called handicapped outside. Age is the last frontier, and because the stigma is always a self-stigma, it's perhaps the most difficult to fight. Armed with this insight, let me turn to my central and concluding policy conclusion. This conclusion is that compulsory retirement should be rejected by us all as a form of unjust discrimination, just as unjust as racial discrimination in hiring, or the exclusion of women from the workplace, or the segregation of children with disabilities in special classrooms. We must carefully distinguish here between the age at which retirement is allowed with full pension and the age at which retirement is required. The US has made this distinction, and compulsory retirement has not been legal since before I entered the workforce. And so my generation has expectations and a sense of self that are not deformed by this pernicious practice. This is a long topic, and I've written about it at length in the new book, but several points can be briefly made. The greatest advantage, I think, of ending compulsory retirement is the same advantage Mill claimed for ending discrimination against women, namely, as he puts it, the advantage of having the central social institutions, quote, based upon justice rather than injustice, okay? But we can also mention other advantages, in particular, the fact now widely acknowledged but seen already by Cato, that work is very important for happiness and for physical health. Among the important dividends of the US regime is the wonderful fact that people by now don't really care about and don't really talk about how old their colleagues are, and the joy of looking ahead to the next day's interaction with colleagues who are themselves of varying ages, thus nourishing non-stigmatic mixed-age friendships, is a very important positive dividend of our regime. This was Cicero's smartest point. For the young man in the dialogue, visit Cato, look up to him, and enjoy his company. Cicero knows how valuable cross-generational friendships are for both older and younger, and he often alludes to his own aging teachers. On the con side, we have to face first the inevitable reply that such policies are too costly. In addition to observing that keeping people productive rather than supporting them through Social Security might actually be thought to be a savings, not a cost, we should reply that when it is a matter of extending to a group equal respect and the equal protection of the laws, expense cuts no legal ice. When the same argument was made against including children with disabilities in integrated public school classrooms in the 1950s, The court said that the financial shortfall of the school district that was griping about including so-called extra children must not be permitted to weigh more heavily on an already disadvantaged group than on the majority. And that was the correct response. And just imagine the response if people were to say, let's exclude women and minorities from the workplace because there are not enough jobs for everyone, or more pointedly, because they are taking our jobs. People of reason would surely rise up, objecting that the full inclusion of all qualified workers on the basis of equality is an urgent issue of justice. Not all people are people of reason, and this so-called argument has been a driving force behind our populist movement of the present day, such as it is. But fear of popular anger should not stop us from doing what is just, any more than the huge violence of the civil rights era stopped the struggle for racial equality. To the objection that aging people require special treatment, mental and physical, we should make Cato's reply. It all depends on your habits. Many don't require anything special at all. Furthermore, suppose they do. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers are right now required to make reasonable accommodations for workers with a wide range of disabilities. So even the extra expense of accommodation is acknowledged as a requirement of justice. But suppose job-related competence really does slip badly, despite all accommodation. Employers under the US system may lure people into retirement, and outside of the academy, people can be fired for cause. What's forbidden is, number one, the refusal to accommodate, and number two, termination simply on grounds of age. This, I think, is as it ought to be, since there's such great variety among aging lives. Compulsory retirement, still the leading form of age discrimination around the world, is one of the great moral evils of our time. The next frontier of justice, to use a term I've used elsewhere, that any theory of human capabilities must address. The stigma attached to the aging body is real, and it has real baneful effects. Work is a great help. Friendship is, I think, an even greater help. But in most movements for social justice, stigmatized people have also felt the need of a more informal anti-disgust movement that creatively reshapes the stigma into something to be embraced. The formal civil rights movement was accompanied by the informal slogan, "Black is beautiful," and a widespread social movement around that idea. The women's movement in my youth invented the slogan, "Our bodies, ourselves," and the wonderful book that went with that, and then set about reclaiming the female body as a site of curiosity and love rather than stigma and disgust. There are many reasons to think that aging people need, in addition to the good political work of ARP, a movement akin to the feminist Our Bodies movement, a movement against self-disgust. I believe this, in the end, was the deeper goal of Cicero's little treatise, to bring a despised topic into graceful and zestful social discourse, to make people study it, have fun with it, maybe even love it. Following my argument, this movement would best be imagined as integrative rather than self-segregating, since, after all, the stigma against aging is lodged in us all, regardless of age. There's little hope of limiting its harmful influence unless one begins with the young. The stigma at its core is a stigma about our embodiment and our mortality. So we ultimately will need to shift attitudes toward the body in order to counter stigma effectively. The Our Bodies movement was partly about autonomy. We said we won't let doctors take over our bodies and extract the babies. We will be awake and active and give birth as ourselves. But it was also very much a rebellion against the idea that the female body is just disgusting, a staple of misogyny the world over. Whether we read the poetry of Walt Whitman or not, we were Whitmanians, saying with him, "I sing the body electric," that triumphant denunciation of all the shames and disgusts that Whitman saw behind the social phenomena of racial aversion, misogyny, and homophobia. Whitman knew that we will not be able to love one another unless we first stop hiding from ourselves, meaning our bodies, which are not platonic forms, which change and age like all bodies in nature. For, as he says, quote, if the body were not the soul, what is the soul? If we could love our bodies, we may possibly, he continues, also love, quote, the likes of them in other men and women, end quote. In a bold crescendo of anti-disgust, Whitman then enumerates, I mean, it's a very long poem, all the parts that we might possibly come to love, starting with the ones we already like pretty well, head, neck, ears, then continuing on to the trunk, but to its rather pleasing outer parts, such as, quote, palm, knuckles, thumb, forefinger, and then on down to the strong thighs supporting the trunk. But then he delves within, caressing with his words, quote, the lung sponges, stomach sac, the bowels sweet and clean, the thin red jellies within you or within me. These, he says, are actually poems, and they are his poems. Quote, oh, I say these are not the parts and poems of the body only, but of the soul. Oh, I say now, these are the soul. It's because we still shrink from Whitman's invitation to self-love that we permit the hideous wrongs of age discrimination to deform our societies. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Before we turn to questions and discussion, I want to remind everyone that Professor Nussbaum will be doing a book signing just outside the theater at the conclusion of this. So if you have a book you'd like her to sign, preferably one that she's written, you can meet her just outside the theater at the conclusion.
I would love it if the first two questions came from students. But generally, say who you are and what you work on.
So we have two microphones here. You can line up at the mics, and we'll also possibly be taking some questions from people who are participating online.
Oh, all right. Well, while the students are getting ready, you can go ahead. This is supposed to be a handheld for me, but it does not seem to be. Is it working at all? It's not as working as much as the other one, but okay.
Hi, Peter Erickson, professor of German here at CSU. I wanted to ask about whether or not there might be a positive potential, a positive political potential for disgust in certain contexts. And I was thinking about the example of Harvey Weinstein and the way that many feminist critiques of Weinstein have had a role for a kind of disgust about his physicality, about the aging male body in a position of power. And on the one hand, maybe in itself, there's something kind of indefensible about this disgust. But as a kind of form of catharsis, or as a form of kind of collective objective disgust that's made it possible for women to tell their stories and to come forward, I'm wondering if there is some sort of ambivalent way that we could try to justify that form of positive potential.
Well, this is a question that always comes up. There's a legal theorist named Dan Kahan who, ever since I was working on this, made arguments of this form, saying that there is a very good use for disgust. We keep it around, then tether it as reliably as we can to the good ends that we want to promote, and then it's very, very powerful. Now, I guess the first thing is to step back and ask what moralized disgust is all about. The first thing is that it is sometimes just a confusion of terms, that people use the word, oh, that's disgusting, when they really mean they're very angry or something. But it's not always. And when it's not, then, as in the example you gave, it does focus, as disgust does, on these bodily features. Now, that means that its role in promoting good ends is highly contingent and highly slippery. Even in the context of the criminal trial, where Kahan tried to argue that at the penalty phase, the disgustingness of a murderer's crimes, that he, you know, if you mention blood and guts and so on a lot, then they'll give a harsher sentence. He liked that. But if you think about what we want to do at the criminal trial, I mean, I'm not a retributivist, so that's a big difference between Kahan and me. But in any case, we want to give punishments that are basically fair. Now, in fact, I think our society thinks that the murder, or the felony murder, like the murder of a bank officer during a holdup, is a particularly bad kind of murder because it's often cold and calculating. But that kind of murder is not accompanied by a whole lot of blood and guts. And so it ends up, I think, giving the wrong result, even in that case. And you get the jury focusing on things that are really often lead to forms of sort of self-congratulation. I'm not at all like that. Instead of thinking productively, here's a criminal malefactor. How did he get to be that way? What is our society like that such malefaction can exist? There, but for the grace of God go I, and so on. So, you know, take disgust at the Nazis, which you could easily whip up by talking about the awful things they did. To focus on Nazis with disgust is a way of short-circuiting useful political investigation of how those phenomena come about in an otherwise sane society. So I'm not for that. And I guess in the Weinstein case, you can easily see how slippery it is because, yeah, I mean, maybe he has certain traits of sweatiness and obesity and so on that are typical objects of disgust. But two things about that. First of all, stigma against obesity is a very bad thing, and we don't want to feed into it. We want to eradicate it, right? And it's a big part of misogyny, too. The second thing is that not all the men who have been accused, rightly, of sexual harassment and sexual violence have those features. So it cuts the wrong way. And what we really need to do is focus on the nature of their acts. And so anyway, that I think it's just not the right way to criticize Weinstein. Yes?
Thanks for stimulating talk. Grow old with me, the best is yet to be. My wife and I, in our 70s, frequently quoted that to each other, and we believed it. But we're in our mid-80s, and you still hope for some things in which you can rejoice, the successes of your grandchildren, and yet you wonder if you don't have to realize that the best is behind you. Do you want to comment?
Well, okay. I mean, look, obviously pain and illness are always bad things, and they often do impede other valuable pursuits. But that can happen at any age. And my grandmother lived to be 104 in relatively good health, and she witnessed the illness and death of all her children. She had 3 sisters who were also above 95, and they all were talking about the illnesses and deaths of their much younger children. So, you know, life is not fair. The lottery of disease and health is terribly unfair, and I have to mourn the deaths of numerous people much younger than myself. So that has nothing to do with age as such. It has to do with disease and death. But I think you're really asking about whether, given what you love to do, the best instances of it don't kind of stop when you're aging. Well, a lot depends on what you choose to do, of course. And I do feel like we can study human life and figure out pretty well that if playing football is what you like to do, you probably should think twice before going into that form of life, because first of all, you're going to have to stop doing it by the time you're in your mid-30s, but second, having done it for so many years, you're going to have a really bad time later on. So, you know, if you are in some other kind of sport, you might still have a lot of space later. You just do something else. Second careers, multiple careers. And I think that's increasingly the way that human life is going and will go. At one point, both the rabbi and the cantor at my temple were second career women in their late 50s who began then. So I think it's a question of what, given my time of life and given the abilities that right now I have, what does it make sense for me to do? And then you find something and you do it. Now, Hillary Putnam was unusual, I think, in being able to continue his philosophical activities at the highest level up until the age of 89. My colleague Amartya Sen is similar, but if not that, then teaching. Often when you're not doing original work in economics, and of course that's a very youth-oriented profession, you still teach very well and get people excited about it in the next generation. Or you turn to the pursuit of friendships or social service or companionship with your spouse. There are so many parts of human life that we often neglect in earlier years that we could do better because we aren't so over busy, as people age. So I guess, and then just as we talk in our book about looking back and figuring out what the arc of your life is, that's something that usually young people are not good at all. They don't have much time for introspection, but thinking about the meaning of life and the general course of life is something that aging people are really, really much better at, and one reason why they flock to humanities courses whenever universities offer courses to older adults. So I guess I think, just figure out what you can do and then do that thing. Don't keep trying to do the thing that you think you can no longer do well enough to make yourself happy.
My name's August. I'm a marital and family therapy student. I'm interested in, given the relationship between disgust for others and kind of self-stigmatization, how you perceive the stake that a person has in challenging their own stereotypes and stigma in the terms of like personal fulfillment and self-satisfaction.
Well, I think often people don't invest enough in challenging it. And there's a whole section of the book, and part of my contribution, so we both write on each topic, but part of my contribution to the love, sex part of it appeared in the New York Times in the Stone column, so you can look that up more easily than reading the book. But I think, aging women often just succumb to the dead weight of exclusion, saying, oh, now you got to renounce, you got to give up sex and love. And even now, when powerful movie stars such as Meryl Streep, Helen Mirren, are challenging it, it's within certain limits. I talk about these movies in the chapter, so you might want to look at that. That the men of these couples, like Jack Nicholson, Om Puri, Alec Baldwin, they can be schlumpy, overweight, and not perfect in their physique, bald or whatever. But the women have to be immaculately groomed and in extremely good physical shape. Helen Mirren says she does not have any cosmetic surgery, and I believe her, but in any case, she is in really, really good shape. So we don't yet have the inclusion of women who look in women the way Alec Baldwin and Jack Nicholson look like for men. And that's what we really ought to have. But in any case, what Saul, my co-author, likes very much are these retirement communities which are age segregated, and he thinks there's more embracing of the aging body when they're just aging people there. These are these communities in Florida and Arizona where children can't come. Well, they can visit briefly, but they can't stay overnight and so on. I'm not happy with those because I think for overall social welfare, they're very bad. They make people take their eye off future generations and so on. But there's no doubt that for dating, sex, and the stigma against the aging body, they're pretty good. And if you read Andrew Bleckman's book, Leisureville, which to me is a horrifying book about narcissism and just, eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you die, not any kind of altruism or larger social consciousness. But the attractive side is, the relationships they form are not marred by this kind of stigma. So I think we should experiment with lots of sources of good relationship. And, no doubt the family can be a real drag on the self-awareness and the self-perception of the aging person.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Will. I am an engineer here at CSU. And my question is actually about retirement homes and kind of the amount of them in the US compared to other areas in the world, especially India, Mexico, you hardly see them. Why have those developed here? And you kind of mentioned that they have benefits to them. Are there benefits to eradicating those or not having as many of them?
Okay, well, I was talking about retirement communities, which are very different from retirement homes. These are communities where sort of people of moderate sort of middle-class affluence can buy a condo, and the whole community is usually focused on golf cart. Everyone gets around by golf carts, so you're not isolated by your inability to drive a car, and there's a lot provided for you. And there is, of course, the medical element, but it's not like a retirement home, which is very much a medicalization of aging in many, many cases. I guess I think we should look at many different types of things, but what we really lack is adequate in-home nursing care. Finland, so there's a book I talk about in our book by a Finnish economist named Anu Partinen about Finland's attitude, which is that people should be able to stay in their own home as long as possible with their own things around them, because that's very important for their health and happiness, and they shouldn't depend entirely on their family. So the public solution is a lot of health visitation in the home. Now, of course, Finland's a country, relatively affluent country of 5 million people, and the communities are pretty easy to navigate. There's public transportation of very high quality all over the place. So it's very different from the US. My own hope is that we at least get more of that, but also that aging people become less housebound when they're in their own home because of things like self-driving cars. The biggest problem for American seniors, if they want to have access to cultural activities, friendship, and just general social mobility, is that they have to give up driving at some point or other. Whether it might be 80, it might be 85, it might be 75. But then in America, you are really lost, which is not the truth, not the case in Europe, where public transportation networks are much more adequate. So I think the self-driving car, and I actually had a lot of talk with the man who was one of the leading designers of the inventors of the self-driving car, because he was one of the other two Kyoto Prize laureates in my year, so we had just many meals together of necessity, but I learned a lot about them. And he did think, and he's now 73, I think, that one of the great dividends of what he did was indeed that it makes aging people much more mobile. So nursing homes, I think are, again, I think there are many types. Some are more medicalized than others. The one my grandmother was in was a kind of elite type, which had, you know, they offered common meals, but you could make your own meal. Everyone had their own kitchen, and that was, you had your own stuff and your own apartment. So that's has some of the virtues of staying in your home, and maybe some advantages of its own, because she had more friends, because there were other people of, well, I won't exactly say similar age, because she lied about her age. She was over 100, and she said she was 80. But the fact was, she had never been out in the sun because she had an allergy, and so she was able, because of her plump and white skin, she was able to pass for 80, 85 when she was over 100. So she had friends in their 80s, and that's why she really didn't want to lose them by saying she was over 100. But anyway, she could have that, whereas in just an ordinary condo community, she probably wouldn't. So I think we have to focus on transportation, non-isolation, and not imposing all the care obligations on the family, which typically means the women of the family, which Japan has been particularly bad at, and they're struggling with now, for example. So those are the things I think are most important, and then whether it's in a group setting or in your own original home, then that's much more flexible.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm Sean Waters, instructor of composition and rhetoric, and I'm wondering about the audience of undergrads who are image conscious and want to do something about this. If you have anything to say about Instagram and the kind of converse of disgust, which this attraction to beauty and...
Yeah. I mean, I'm not on any social media, so I'm the last one who would claim to know anything about this, but I do worry a lot about social media peddling a version, especially of the female body through internet porn, that makes women have more self-disgust than before. I mean, I talk a lot to students of mine about things like disgust for pubic hair and just in general, the stereotype of what the good female body is like that has become deeply entrenched through internet porn, and it's hard to shake it because that is the template that forms younger men's sexual desire. So, you know, I think the solution for that has to be to create alternatives to that and to try to eroticize different body shapes and structures, but it's really, really hard to do. I know much more about how you would do it rhetorically and poetically than how you would do it on social media. But anyway, movies and television, at least there, people are going toward that. And Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda are doing their great job. So I think television especially, which is less costly to do than the movies, has a major role in purveying new forms of vision of the attractive body. Of course, Jane Fonda is a ridiculous one in the sense that she's just probably spent about 90% of her waking hours on keeping her body a certain way. But Lily Tomlin is not like that. So anyway, I think we do have a lot to worry about in the social media era. Very hard to combat, but we just have to be resourceful and try to hope, as is happening, I think, that aging artists, including people like Lily Tomlin, Helen Mirren, Jane Fonda even, will use their fame for good ends and try to destigmatize other people's bodies.
My name is Chester. I was a student here 50 years ago. We live in a society where it seems pretty clear that a large part of the ruling corporate government elite regard huge swaths of the population as disgusting and disposable. They are slashing through medical care for all kinds of groups, have their Social Security that I depend on and Medicare in their targets, and yet the country finds $1 trillion a year to spend on a global military intelligence operation. So it's not a matter of money, it's a matter of goals and values. The handicapped, all kinds of people are in their targets. And so I think that the categories that you described as being treated with disgust and disdain are many, including older people.
Oh yeah, and in our volume, The Empire of Disgust, we talk about class, and we say, well, it looks like class is different, it's about money, it's not about disgust, but then we argue against that, and we have a very fine paper by my colleague Laura Weinrib, an expert in labor law, where she does argue that a lot of class-based disdain and resultant political neglect is fueled by disgust. I mean, this goes all the way back, way back, but it certainly appears in George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, where he says he went to live with this lower-class family, and lo and behold, the dishes were dirty, the house had dust. I mean, it sounds like actually the description of upper-class British houses that I've been in, because the typical upper-class British way of doing the dishes is to put them all in the sink, fill it up with soap, and then just lift it out of the soapy water and put it in the drying rack without any rinsing in clear water. That's what you're supposed to do. But anyway, so Orwell describes with horror and disgust as lower class customs that are ubiquitous in the upper class. So that shows you how that stigma, how fictive it is and how deforming it is, and it still exists. Now, my colleague, Laura Weinrib, argues that nonetheless, disgust can have a positive value in the struggle against class-based isolation and neglect, because if we can point to the foul conditions in some housing project or some slum where people are living, this can help. I mean, this goes back to the first question about good, productive disgust. It can help mobilize people to really deal with that. I am skeptical, as you might see from what I said to the previous questioner. I think that that can produce short-lived action, but entrench further the real underlying loathing and so on. So yeah, I mean, the objects are many, and the rhetoric of disgust is used all over the place to other and marginalize, and this is why I really believe that the solution has got to be in a new attitude toward the animal body. I mean, I work a lot on the rights of animals, and there's no doubt that the animal, you know, that is one of the biggest problems in the modern effort to get humane treatment for animals. The people just are, they avoid them, they're disgusted with them, and so on. So, you know, one structure of domination is so closely linked to another. My friend, the feminist artist Judy Chicago, has a new work which is about how humans face their death and their mortal bodies, but then it goes on to be about how we impose death and extinction on animal species. And people have challenged her and said, well, I thought you were a feminist. What does this have to do with feminism? And she said, I think feminism is actually about undoing all the structures of hierarchy and domination. And I do think that you know, you got to work on the one that you're working on, because that's the way progress gets made. But in the end, they all are interconnected.
Hello, my name is Geneva. I'm a student. And I think something I wanted to talk about or ask you about was that there was an instance in where I was actually the recipient of kind of an ageist, and I didn't even recognize it. That was, I think, the bigger problem for me, was that I didn't even recognize that it was based on age until after I'd gotten into it. And it wasn't so much the body degradation, but the stagnation of the mind, that at some point, older people are resistant to change. So I was curious about your thoughts on that in relation to what you're discussing.
Well, I think this idea is, of course, it's ubiquitous. I do feel like we impose some of that, most of that, on older people by things like compulsory retirement, where they're not able to access new challenges. But I also think we have to be very careful not to become averse to new challenges. I mean, my remarks about social media indicate that maybe I'm too averse to learning about some new things. I worry about that, except that I feel like I need all the hours of the day that I have, and I don't know that this would be a productive use of them. So many people use their whole day on Facebook and Twitter and so on. So anyway, but I try to make up for that by making sure that every time I write something, younger people are going to be challenging it, and that I'm in company with younger people in all walks of my life. And I do think that it's something that can happen to older people, that they get set in their ways, but it can also happen to younger people. And the way it happens in younger people is they become fashion conscious, and they're only going to write about the current trendy issue in philosophy, whereas those of us who have the longer view might say, well, you know, might still be useful to read Aristotle or Kant, or indeed John Rawls, and not just talk about grounding or whatever the latest fatty issue is in philosophy. And so, you know, different forms of rigidity take place in different generations. When Amartya Sen and I wanted to have a very experimental and flexible group of people to challenge reigning norms in development economics with the capabilities approach, we thought at first of trying some of the famous older people, but we also at the same time tried some very young people, and our prediction was that the younger people would be much better, that they would be more flexible. But actually, I mean, no one from economics was very good at adopting a new approach, I have to say. But the younger people were much worse because they were insecure, they were fearful, they needed the approval of the profession more. So as time has gone on, it's people like Kaushik Basu and other very eminent people, he's the chief economist of the World Bank, who have been able to see the virtue in a new approach. So, you know, they're different. So we should all avoid rigidity. We should all think through new challenges, but not just grab onto them because they're trendy. So it's a very hard judgment call. And we should all be wrestling with that, I think, all the time.
We're right at 3:30, so
Okay. Thank you so much. You're utterly brilliant, and it was delightful. I wanted to ask if you had a comment on the social science research. I've not read the study from which this came, so I don't know anything about the methodology, but that showed a correlation in political affiliation between disgust and right-leaning voters. And so Republicans being more likely to have a higher level of disgust than liberals. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I have read that, and these are students of Paul Rosen's. I think there are some problems with the D scale, which is, they ask people, how strongly averse are you to this and this and this and this, and you give a number, and then they calculate how high up you are on the D scale. And of course, they don't use the word disgust. They try to describe in other words what the thing is that they're thinking about disgust for. Now, one of the problems that I see in that is that some of the things they put on this list are really, for many people anyway, better dealt with under worry about harm or fear. So one of their central examples is, how do you feel about humans having sex with animals? Well, I feel that that's a horrible violation of the animal. But, I don't get to say that on their test. I get to say only, number 9, I feel about that. So that, to me, just shows the test is not right. They also say, and this is pertinent to my current condition, getting over a cold, how bad do you feel about somebody giving you I don't know, a handkerchief with mucus on it? Well, as not just a speaker, but also an amateur singer, like every singer I know, I'm very germophobic. And I don't want to spread germs to other people either, because that's not what people should do. And so I feel like that's about sane reaction to a risk, not about disgust. There could be disgust. Some people would be averse to that because of disgust, but that would not be every person. So I guess I think, we'd have to take apart the questionnaires filled out by those people to figure out how good it is. But I'm not too surprised, simply because what their target is explaining aversion to same-sex marriage and gay rights. So they put it to work in that specific instance. And I think some of their questions are, how do you vote on those issues? And I know, because I've done a lot of work on it, motivation is whipped up by appeal to disgust. So pamphlets saying gay people eat feces and drink raw blood are very common in the Amendment 2, the build up to the passage of Amendment 2 here in Colorado. I was in the courtroom when Will Perkins testified that he had circulated such pamphlets to people in the state of Colorado. So, given that they're using disgust to mobilize, then it's not too surprising that the people who are higher on the D scale are the ones who are behind those policies. There's also a pamphlet by the Family Research Council that says, called Medical Consequences of Homosexuality, which is all a mobilization of disgust around the physical qualities of anal intercourse. And so, that's a big part of homophobia in the United States. So if they meant Republicans on tax policy, it would be more surprising. But since the Republican Party is far from being united, and what they're really talking about is people who are conservative on issues of homophobia and same-sex marriage, then I think it's not. Their finding would be very surprising if it was anything else, because these movements usually know they create and play up what it is they want to hold people together by. So anyway, I think they should continue to do more work like that. I think it's really interesting work, but I think it has its defects.